The Low Altitude Assault Transport, or LAAT, or LAAT, was one of the most important vehicles in the Galactic Army of the Republic and was instrumental in countless Republic victories. The rumble of its engines bolstered clone spirits and struck fear into the metal hearts of the Separatist droids. It is no surprise that a vehicle as successful as the LAAT would spawn many variants and derivatives. I'm Joey from Radio Free Coruscant, and this is the LAAT line. VAAT. The history of the LAAT begins with the VAAT/E, or Variable Altitude Assault Transport Enforcement. This was a gunship used primarily by the Coruscant Security Force to deploy troops. It was relatively uncommon but fairly successful. It was 25 meters long and 25 meters wide. It carried 2 dual heavy laser turrets and a mass driver missile launcher. It required a crew of 3 and could carry 15 passengers and a medical droid. This gunship's design inspired the design of the LAAT and would eventually be replaced by a spin-off of the LAAT, the LAAT LE. After it was retired, it was used by galactic vacant building demolitions to destroy abandoned buildings in low-orbit bombardments. LAATI. The most well-known member of the LAAT family is the original LAATI, or Low Altitude Assault Transport Infantry. This gunship was used by the Grand Army of the Republic to transport troops into combat and attack enemy ground forces. It cost 85,000 credits and was manufactured by Rothana Heavy Engineering. The LAATI measured 17.7 meters long by 17 meters wide and 6.9 meters tall. It had a maximum atmospheric speed of 620 kilometers per hour or 388 miles per hour. The LAAT was one of the most heavily armed craft of its size ever made. It was armed with 3 anti-personnel cannons, 4 composite beam pinpoint laser turrets, 8 wing-mounted air-to-air rockets, and 2 mass driver missile launchers. These mass drivers launched missiles at hypersonic speeds similar to the main gun on the ATTE, though that fired either plasma bolts or tungsten shells rather than missiles. It required a pilot and a co-pilot who also manned the forward guns. If it was equipped with the 2 side-mounted composite beam turrets, which were optional, it needed an additional gunner for each. The LAAT could carry a platoon of 30 clone troopers, 4 speeder bikes, and a small amount of cargo. There were a couple of alternate variants of the LAATI. The original LAAT had doors that were not airtight, and the side turrets were mounted on struts attached to the bulkhead inside the craft. There was a small secondary door ahead of the main troop door on each side. The Type 2 LAAT was nearly identical to the original, but it was modified so that the side turrets were mounted on external sockets where the forward doors used to be. This made them removable to allow a wider mission profile and allowed the main troop doors to have an airtight seal. This meant that the LAAT could be dropped from orbit without having to land a Venator or Acclimator to deploy it into battle. It lacked sufficient repulsor lift strength to reach orbit afterward and would have to be picked up in atmosphere after the battle. There was also a further variant called the Space Gunship. This was nearly identical to the Type 2 LAAT, but had artificial gravity for the troops inside, more powerful repulsor lifts to escape the gravity of the planet, and 2 huge floodlights mounted to the turret sockets. A fourth variant was identical to the original LAAT, but featured 2 small ion engines on the back of the mass drivers to enable higher speeds. This model was very rare. LAAT-V. The Low Altitude Assault Transport Vehicle was a version of the LAAT designed to carry light vehicles into combat. It was visually identical to the infantry model, but had enough differences to warrant its own designation. It could carry up to 16 speeder bikes, which could probably be swapped out for ATRTs or anything else that would fit in it. It's unclear why it needed its own designation, but perhaps it carried some kind of racks inside to hold the speeder bikes, or some other infrastructure that made it different internally than the LAATI. LAATS. The Low-Altitude Assault Transport Stealth was a variant of the LAAT space gunship, which was equipped with a hyperdrive and stealth technology. It was extremely rare. We only know of one time when this ship was used. A squad of clone commandos used one to infiltrate the separatist-occupied planet Tiran. It successfully evaded detection by the Confederate fleet, but crashed due to an unforeseen storm and was blown up by the clones to protect its secrets. LAAT-C. The Low-Altitude Assault Transport Carrier was a highly modified version of the LAAT. It retained the same basic form, but was equipped to haul heavy equipment such as the ATTE, Falchion tank, and similarly sized vehicles. It cost a whopping 175,000 credits, and was armed with 4 light laser cannons and 4 air-to-ground rockets. It kept the 2 nose cannons of the infantry model and added an additional turret in the rear. It replaced the LAATI's mass drivers with 2 ion engines, which could propel it up to 620 km per hour like the LAAT, even with its heavier load. It had a crew of 3 with a pilot, co-pilot, and loadmaster, and a capacity of 2 passengers. The troop bay was removed to make space to haul the required cargo underneath the ship with 2 magnetic clamps. The ship was lengthened to 28.8 meters long to accommodate this as well. LAAT-LE. The Low-Altitude Assault Transport Law Enforcement was designed to be a smaller, more maneuverable, and cheaper alternative to the LAATI. It was primarily used for law enforcement in dense cities like Coruscant, but after the formation of the Empire, it was reimagined as a light patrol craft for the Imperial Army and could be seen on Imperial bases across the galaxy. Some Imperial Star Destroyers also carried LEs to use as docking tugs and landing craft. The LE measured 11.5 meters long by 5.8 meters wide and 5.4 meters tall. It cost 62,000 credits and required 2 crew, a pilot and a gunner. It had 2 forward and 1 rear light laser cannons and 2 missile launchers. It could carry roughly 6 to 10 passengers or a small amount of cargo and was equipped with a searchlight to follow suspects. It also had 4 solar collectors to extend its operational range. While not intended to replace the LAATI, it certainly outlived it, being used by the New Republic at least as late as 10 ABY. MAAT. The multi-altitude assault transport used by the Empire in Legends was intended to be a successor to the LAATI, but it was not a particularly common ship. We don't know much about it, and it only appeared once in the Force Unleashed video game, and only in the PlayStation 2, PSP, and Wii versions of the game. It was less well-armed than any other ship in the LAAT line and couldn't carry as many troops. What it could do, though, is transport them to higher altitudes. It was designed to deploy troops from ships to the ground like the LAAT, but also to deploy troops from the ground to high-elevation installations and even orbiting spacecraft. It also had the distinction of looking a bit like the ARC-170 starfighter. Interestingly, like I mentioned, the MAAT was only in the PS2, PSP, and Wii versions of The Force Unleashed. In all other platforms of the game, such as PC, Mac, Xbox, PS3, and Nintendo Switch, the Empire uses the Imperial Dropship transport instead. IDT. The Imperial Dropship transport is similar in shape to the LAAT, but with a much more angular construction that looks like someone tried to draw the LAAT from memory. It measured 16.8 meters long by 20 meters wide. It was armed with 2 mass driver missile launchers, 2 light laser cannons, and 2 blaster cannons. It had a crew of 1 pilot and 1 gunner and could carry around 18 passengers. The LAAT was one of the most successful and influential war vehicles of its time, leaving behind a legacy of over half a dozen spin-offs and variants. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of it and its descendants. If so, please subscribe and leave a comment to tell me what LAAT is your favorite or what subject you'd like to see in a video next. I've got one about droids coming out in a few weeks that I think you'll love. Until then, be sure to check out my other Star Wars ship breakdowns and more. RFC out.